The glass towers of the financial district caught the amber glow of the setting sun, their polished surfaces reflecting the golden light that bathed the most exclusive business corridor in the city. It was 6:15 p.m. on a Thursday evening, the kind of time when the day traders had gone home and the serious power brokers emerged, men in $1,000 suits and women carrying briefcases that cost more than most people's monthly salary, all moving through the marble-lined lobbies with the quiet confidence that comes from controlling millions of other people's money. Special Agent Keisha Williams stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Financial Tower, her heels clicking against the Italian marble as she paused to check her phone. At 34, she carried herself with the controlled precision of someone who'd spent 12 years investigating the kind of financial crimes that could topple governments. Her charcoal gray blazer was perfectly tailored, her natural hair styled in a professional updo that had survived a 14-hour day of depositions and evidence review. The FBI badge in her leather briefcase felt heavier than usual after the meeting she'd just concluded, another piece of the puzzle in a money laundering investigation that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. She had exactly 45 minutes to get across town to her apartment, shower, and change for the evening briefing with her task force. The Serbian organized crime syndicate they'd been tracking for 8 months had just made a critical mistake, and tonight's surveillance operation could be the break they needed to shut down a $250 million operation. After spending the last 6 hours reviewing bank records with executives who'd seemed more concerned about their stock prices than their compliance violations, Keisha was looking forward to getting back to real police work. But as Keisha began walking down the pristine sidewalk toward the parking garage, she was unaware that her presence had already been noted by someone whose worldview couldn't accommodate the sight of a black woman moving confidently through spaces he'd mentally reserved for others. Officer Derek Hayes had been patrolling the financial district for 3 years, and in his mind, those 3 years had made him an expert at reading the neighborhood's rhythms. At 38, he stood 6'2" with the kind of build that came from police academy training and too many late-night fast food runs. Imposing enough to command respect, soft enough around the edges to suggest he'd grown comfortable with the authority his uniform provided. His patrol car was always spotless, his equipment properly maintained, and his radio positioned prominently on his shoulder where everyone could see the symbol of his power. Derek took pride in what he called his street sense. He could spot trouble from 3 blocks away, could identify the white-collar criminals who thought their expensive suits made them untouchable, could sense when someone was walking through his territory without proper respect for the order he worked to maintain. At least, that's how he explained it to himself and his fellow officers during break-room conversations. Others might have called it profiling, but Derek preferred to think of it as experience-based intuition. And right now, his intuition was telling him that the black woman who'd just emerged from Sterling Financial was trouble. She was too confident, too comfortable, too present. In Derek's 3 years patrolling the financial district, he developed an internal catalog of who belonged in these spaces and who didn't. The bank executives' wives who lunched at the private clubs, the daughters of investment firm partners who shopped at the boutiques, the politicians' spouses who occasionally graced the charity events. They all had a certain way of moving through the district that announced their right to be there. This woman had that same confidence, but something about it set Derek's teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way she didn't look around nervously like the black professionals who occasionally had business meetings in the district, the ones who seemed to expect scrutiny and were grateful when they didn't receive it. This woman acted like she owned the street, and that attitude bothered Derek in a way he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. Unit 7 to control, he spoke quietly into his radio, his eyes tracking Keisha as she approached the intersection. I've got a possible situation developing on Madison between 5th and 6th. Black female, early 30s, business attire. She's moving with purpose, but something feels off about her presence in the area. Copy that, Unit 7, came the response from dispatch. What's your assessment of the situation? Derek watched as Keisha stopped at the crosswalk, checking her phone with the kind of casual familiarity that suggested she navigated these streets regularly. Her posture was straight, her gaze forward, and she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional environments. Could be casing the banks or investment firms, Derek replied, the words flowing easily despite having no evidence to support them. The confidence feels calculated, you know? Like she's trying too hard to blend into an environment where she doesn't naturally belong. I'm going to keep an eye on her. The truth was, Keisha's confidence didn't feel calculated at all. It felt natural, earned, authentic. And that's exactly what bothered Derek. In his worldview, there were people who belonged in places like the financial district and people who didn't, and the boundaries were clearly defined by factors he'd never had to examine too closely. When someone crossed those boundaries too easily, too naturally, it disrupted the social order that made Derek feel secure in his role as guardian of these exclusive spaces. Keisha reached the corner and paused to check the traffic signal, unaware that she was being observed and categorized by someone who had already decided she represented a threat to the neighborhood's carefully maintained atmosphere. In her mind, she was simply a federal agent heading home after a long day of following money trails and building cases against people who thought their wealth made them untouchable. As Keisha studied her phone, reviewing the evening's surveillance briefing materials, Derek positioned his patrol car where he could observe her movements while maintaining the appearance of routine patrol duties. He noted the way other pedestrians moved around her without giving her a second glance, the way the security guards at the building entrances nodded respectfully as she passed. None of it should have seemed suspicious to a reasonable observer. But reasonable wasn't a word that applied to Derek's assessment of the situation. In his mind, Keisha's seamless integration into the environment was itself evidence of deception. Real professionals who belonged in the financial district didn't have to work at fitting in. It came naturally because they'd been raised in these circles, educated at the right schools, connected to the right families. The fact that Keisha seemed so comfortable could only mean she was very good at whatever game she was playing. She's checking what looks like work materials on her phone, Derek reported into his radio, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed his suspicions were based on professional expertise rather than personal prejudice. Taking her time, like she's familiarizing herself with the area layout. Definitely conducting some kind of reconnaissance. Keisha found the message she was looking for, a text from her partner confirming that the evening surveillance team was in position and the target had been spotted entering the restaurant where the money handoff was supposed to occur. She smiled slightly, feeling the familiar rush of a case coming together after months of meticulous investigation. She began walking toward the parking garage where she'd left her car, unaware that Derek was now following at a discreet distance, his hand resting casually on the radio clipped to his shoulder. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a patrol officer making his routine rounds through the business district. But Derek's focus was entirely on Keisha, his suspicions growing with each confident step she took through what he considered his territory. The evening was about to take a turn that neither Keisha nor Derek could have anticipated. She was simply a federal agent heading home between shifts in a complex investigation that would ultimately save taxpayers millions of dollars and put dangerous criminals behind bars. He was a patrol officer whose prejudices had created a threat where none existed, whose need to maintain what he saw as the natural order was about to put him on a collision course with someone who had far more authority than he could possibly imagine. The confrontation that's about to unfold will show you exactly what happens when racial profiling meets federal authority. But before we see this officer's world completely turn upside down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, what happens when this FBI agent reveals her badge will have you cheering out loud, and the consequences this cop faces will be talked about in police training for years to come. You're not going to want to miss how this ends, so stick around for the most satisfying takedown of prejudice you've ever witnessed. As Keisha approached the entrance to the parking garage, she was thinking about the evening's operation and whether they'd finally have enough evidence to secure federal indictments. She was thinking about the Serbian crime family's money laundering operation and how satisfying it would be to watch their financial empire crumble. She wasn't thinking about the patrol officer who was convinced she was a criminal or the confrontation that was building like a storm cloud behind her. She had no idea that her next few minutes would test everything she believed about professional courtesy, federal authority, and the power of maintaining composure under pressure. But Derek Hayes was about to learn a lesson about assumptions, about prejudice, and about what happens when you mistake someone's earned confidence for criminal behavior. He was about to discover that not every black woman in a business district was someone he could intimidate or control. Some of them carried federal badges and had the authority to make his professional life very complicated. Some of them had spent years investigating people who thought their positions made them untouchable. Special Agent Keisha Williams was about to become one of those people who reminded Derek Hayes that real authority doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from the law itself. The parking garage beneath the Sterling Financial Complex was one of those exclusive facilities where monthly spots cost more than most people's rent, and the security cameras were positioned to protect Bentleys and Teslas rather than monitor suspicious activity. Keisha had parked on the third level that morning, choosing a space that would allow her quick access to the street if her investigation required rapid deployment. She'd learned long ago that federal agents who survived in financial crimes always planned their exits before they needed them. As she approached her metallic blue sedan, an unmarked bureau vehicle equipped with communications equipment that could coordinate multi-agency operations, Keisha noticed the echo of footsteps that seemed to match her pace too precisely to be coincidental. Her training kicked in automatically. The same situational awareness that had kept her alive during undercover operations in some of the most dangerous financial districts in Eastern Europe. She paused beside her car, pretending to search for her keys while using the reflection in the tinted windows to assess her surroundings. That's when she spotted him, a patrol officer who'd positioned himself near the garage entrance, trying to look casual while clearly observing her movements. Derek had followed Keisha into the parking garage under the pretense of conducting a security check, though he had no jurisdiction in the private facility and no legal authority to be there. His radio crackled with routine dispatch calls, a fender bender on the west side, a noise complaint at a downtown apartment complex, the mundane police work that filled most officer shifts. But Derek's attention was entirely focused on the woman who just demonstrated she had legitimate access to one of the city's most exclusive parking facilities. Unit 7 to control, Derek whispered into his radio, positioning himself behind a concrete pillar where he thought he couldn't be observed. Subject has accessed the premium parking garage. Either she's got legitimate business here, or she's running a very sophisticated operation. The dispatcher's voice came back with a note of confusion. Unit 7, are you requesting backup for a parking violation? Derek's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. Negative control. This is potentially much bigger than a parking violation. Request permission to make contact and verify identity. There was a pause on the radio, the kind of silence that suggested someone was trying to figure out how to tell a field officer that he was creating a problem where none existed. Unit 7, what specific crime do you suspect this individual of committing? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. Derek realized he didn't have an answer that would sound reasonable over the radio, where conversations were recorded and could be reviewed by supervisors who might not understand the subtle indicators that experienced officers learn to recognize. Possible identity theft or credit card fraud, Derek replied, the lie flowing more easily than it should have. High-end vehicles in this garage make it a target for sophisticated financial crimes. I'm going to verify her identity and confirm she has legitimate access. Keisha had heard enough. Her FBI training included extensive coursework on police procedures, civil rights law, and the fine line between reasonable suspicion and harassment. What she was witnessing was a patrol officer who had no probable cause, no specific allegations, and no legal justification for the surveillance he was conducting. She turned and walked directly toward Derek, her movements deliberate and confident. Her federal credentials were in her briefcase, but she wanted to see how far this officer would take his unfounded suspicions before she revealed exactly who he was dealing with. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that comes from years of dealing with hostile subjects during interrogations. "Is there something I can help you with?" Derek was caught off guard by her directness. Most people he'd surveilled either tried to avoid contact or became visibly nervous when confronted by police. This woman was approaching him with a kind of calm confidence that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with law enforcement as an equal rather than a subject. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Hayes with Metro Police," Derek replied, straightening to his full height and letting his hand rest on his duty belt where his badge and radio were prominently displayed. "I've been observing some unusual activity in this area, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." Keisha's eyebrows rose slightly. "Unusual activity? Could you be more specific about what you observed that seemed unusual?" The question was a trap, though Derek didn't recognize it as such. Keisha was giving him an opportunity to articulate specific, objective reasons for his suspicions, the kind of reasonable, articulable facts that would be required if this encounter ever came under legal scrutiny. "Well," Derek said, suddenly realizing that walking confidently while black wasn't something he could say out loud, "you've been moving through the financial district with what appeared to be purposeful intent. And now you're accessing this exclusive parking facility." "Purposeful intent," Keisha repeated, her tone suggesting she was filing away every word for future reference. "Officer Hayes, is it illegal to walk with purpose in this city? And is there some law that prohibits certain people from parking in facilities where they have legitimate access?" Derek's face flushed red. This woman was questioning his authority, challenging his professional judgment, and speaking to him with a kind of casual dismissal that suggested she thought she was his equal. In 3 years of patrol work, he'd never encountered someone who responded to police contact with such confident pushback. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Derek said, his voice taking on the harder edge he used when civilians weren't showing proper respect for his badge. "We've had reports of credit card fraud and identity theft in this area, and I need to verify that you have legitimate business here." Another lie, and this one was more serious. Derek had just claimed there were reports of specific crimes to justify his demand for identification, reports that didn't exist from complainants who had never called, about crimes that had never been committed. Keisha felt the familiar calculation running through her mind, the same mental mathematics that every black professional learned to perform when confronted by law enforcement. How much dignity was she willing to sacrifice to avoid escalation? How far could she push back before this became something that could spiral beyond her control? But this time, the calculation was different. This time, she wasn't just a citizen trying to navigate a hostile encounter with police. She was a federal agent with 12 years of experience, extensive knowledge of civil rights law, and the authority to hold this officer accountable for his actions. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when interviewing suspects who thought they were smarter than the FBI. "I want to be very clear about something. You've now claimed there are reports of crimes in this area. I'm going to need you to provide me with the specific report numbers, the nature of those crimes, and the evidence that connects me to those alleged criminal activities." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He'd expected compliance, gratitude, or, at worst, nervous resistance. He hadn't expected to be cross-examined by someone who spoke like she understood police procedures better than he did. "Look, lady," Derek said, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy, "I don't need to justify my investigation to you. You can either cooperate with this inquiry, or I can call for backup, and we can sort this out at the station." The threat hung in the air between them like a challenge that couldn't be taken back. Derek had just threatened to arrest a federal agent for the crime of asking him to justify his actions, actions that had no legal foundation and no legitimate purpose. Keisha smiled, and Derek would later realize that the expression on her face should have warned him that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. "Officer Hayes," she said, reaching into her briefcase with deliberate, visible movements, "I think it's time we had a more honest conversation about what's really happening here." Derek's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon as Keisha reached into her briefcase, a reaction that revealed just how far his paranoia had escalated this routine encounter. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of tactical positioning that police officers learn in academy training, designed to maintain what they call officer safety during unpredictable encounters. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Derek commanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd convinced himself he was dealing with a dangerous situation. Step away from the bag and put your hands on the vehicle. The parking garage suddenly felt smaller, more confined, as if the concrete walls were closing in around them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Derek's face look more angular, more threatening. In the distance, the sound of traffic from the street above filtered down through the ventilation system, a reminder that the outside world continued its normal rhythm, while this confrontation spiraled toward something that could change both their lives forever. Keisha's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. She'd been in hostile situations before, interrogating Russian mob accountants in Brighton Beach, serving federal warrants on militia compounds in Montana, conducting undercover operations in financial districts, where one wrong word could blow months of investigation. But this was different. This was a police officer whose prejudices had created a phantom threat, and his fear was making him dangerous. "Officer Hayes," Keisha said, her voice maintaining the calm authority she'd perfected through years of de-escalating volatile situations. "I'm going to move very slowly and show you my federal credentials. I'm a special agent with the FBI, and what's happening here is a serious violation of my civil rights." The words hit Derek like physical blows. FBI, federal credentials, civil rights violations. These weren't terms that street criminals used, weren't phrases that came from people who were trying to run scams in parking garages. This was the vocabulary of someone who understood the legal system well enough to know exactly what Derek had just stepped into. "Right," Derek said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "And I'm the Director of Homeland Security. Lady, I've heard every con in the book. Identity theft is getting more sophisticated every year, and federal credentials are exactly the kind of thing that high-level scammers would forge." But even as Derek spoke the words, doubt was creeping into his voice. The woman in front of him wasn't acting like any criminal he'd ever encountered. She wasn't nervous, wasn't trying to flee, wasn't making the kind of mistakes that guilty people made under pressure. Instead, she was speaking with the clinical precision of someone who understood police procedures well enough to know that Derek was violating them. Keisha slowly opened her briefcase, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening. Inside, nestled in a leather credential case that had been worn smooth by 12 years of federal service, was the gold badge and identification card that marked her as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. "I'm going to show you my credentials now," she said, extracting the leather case with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed. "And then I'm going to ask you to explain to me exactly what specific, articulable facts led you to believe I was engaged in criminal activity." Derek watched as Keisha opened the credential case, revealing the unmistakable gold shield of the FBI. The badge caught the fluorescent light, its surface gleaming with a kind of authenticity that couldn't be faked. Next to it, behind a clear plastic window, was Keisha's official identification card, complete with her photograph, signature, and the federal security features that made FBI credentials among the most difficult documents in the world to counterfeit. For a moment, Derek's world seemed to stop rotating. He stared at the badge, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't a street criminal or a sophisticated scammer. This was a federal law enforcement officer with 12 years of experience and the authority to investigate everything from bank fraud to domestic terrorism. That could be fake," Derek said, though his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "You can buy anything online these days. Badges, credentials, identification cards." Keisha smiled, and the expression was completely devoid of warmth. "Officer Hayes, you're welcome to call the FBI field office to verify my identity. The number is 555-0147. Ask for Supervisory Special Agent Martinez in financial crimes. He'll be very interested to hear about this encounter." The specificity of the information hit Derek like cold water. Scammers didn't provide direct phone numbers to federal offices. They didn't give names of supervisors who could be easily verified. They didn't speak with the kind of confidence that suggested they wanted law enforcement to investigate their claims. Derek's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension in the parking garage. "Unit 7, Your supervisor is requesting a status update on your location and current activity. The request for a status update wasn't routine. It meant someone in the department was starting to ask questions about why Derek had been conducting an extended investigation in a private parking garage, away from his assigned patrol area, without backup or specific complaints to justify his presence. Unit 7 to control, Derek replied, his voice betraying more stress than he intended. Still conducting the investigation. No immediate backup required. Copy, Unit 7. Supervisor requests you contact him directly on Channel 4. The instruction to switch to a supervisory channel meant Derek's sergeant wanted to have a conversation that wouldn't be broadcast to every unit in the field. It meant questions were being asked at levels above his pay grade, and his explanation for this encounter was going to be scrutinized by people who understood the legal boundaries of police authority better than Derek apparently did. Keisha had been listening to the radio traffic with the trained ear of someone who'd spent years coordinating with local law enforcement agencies. She understood the significance of supervisory intervention, recognized the signs of a patrol officer who was about to face some very difficult questions about his actions. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when interviewing subjects who were finally beginning to understand the seriousness of their situation. "I think you should seriously consider how you want to explain this encounter to your supervisor. Because right now, you've detained a federal agent without cause, demanded identification without reasonable suspicion, and threatened arrest for exercising constitutional rights." Derek's face had gone through several color changes during this exchange, finally settling on a pale gray that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. In 3 years of patrol work, he'd never encountered a situation like this. He'd never had to explain to supervisors why he'd been harassing federal law enforcement officers, never had to justify his actions to someone who understood police procedures well enough to document every violation he'd committed. "Look," Derek said, his voice losing all trace of the authority he displayed just minutes earlier. "Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. I was just responding to... we've had reports of..." "What reports?" Keisha interrupted, her tone sharpening. "You mentioned reports of credit card fraud and identity theft. I want to see those reports. I want the case numbers, the complainants' names, and the specific evidence that led you to believe I was connected to those alleged crimes." The questions were coming with the rapid-fire precision of someone conducting a federal interrogation, and Derek realized he was trapped in a web of lies that was tightening around him with each word he spoke. There were no reports. There had been no crimes. His entire justification for this encounter was based on nothing more than his own prejudicial assumptions about who belonged in the financial district. "The reports are..." Derek stammered, his mind racing for some explanation that wouldn't sound completely implausible. "Officer Hayes," Keisha said, her voice cutting through his confusion with surgical precision, "you're lying. There are no reports. There have been no crimes. You saw a black woman walking through a neighborhood where you didn't think she belonged, and you decided to harass her based on nothing more than your own racial prejudices." The words hung in the air between them like accusations that couldn't be taken back. Derek felt his career, his reputation, and his understanding of himself crumbling around him as Keisha articulated the truth he'd been trying to avoid confronting. "That's not... I never said anything about race," Derek protested weakly. "This has nothing to do with..." "Doesn't it?" Keisha asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd encountered this kind of prejudice countless times throughout her career. "You saw a black woman in an expensive suit walking confidently through the financial district, and your first instinct was to assume she was engaged in criminal activity. You followed me, surveilled me, lied to your dispatcher about the reasons for your investigation, and threatened to arrest me when I asked you to justify your actions." Each word hit Derek like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the ugly reality of what he'd done. He'd always told himself he wasn't racist, had convinced himself that his suspicions were based on experience and training rather than prejudice. But listening to Keisha articulate his actions with such clinical precision, He couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Keisha's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she glanced at the screen to see her partner's name. Agent Marcus Torres was probably calling to confirm the evening surveillance operation, unaware that his partner was currently dealing with a situation that could escalate into a federal civil rights investigation. "I need to take this call," Keisha announced, holding up her phone where Derek could see it. "It's my FBI partner calling about a federal investigation. You're welcome to listen to the conversation if you'd like to verify my identity." Derek watched as Keisha answered the call, her voice immediately shifting into the professional tone of someone coordinating law enforcement operations. "Torres, this is Williams," she said, putting the call on speaker. "I'm going to be about 30 minutes late for the evening briefing. I'm currently dealing with a situation involving a Metro police officer who's detained me without cause." Agent Torres's voice came through the speaker with obvious concern. "Keisha, do you need backup? Should I contact the field office?" "Not yet," Keisha replied, her eyes never leaving Derek's increasingly pale face. "But I want you to document this conversation. I'm with Officer Derek Hayes, badge number." She paused, reading Derek's name tag, 2847 Metro Police. "He's accused me of credit card fraud and identity theft without any evidence, demanded my identification without reasonable suspicion, and threatened arrest when I asked him to justify his actions." "Jesus, Keisha." Torres's voice carried the frustration of someone who dealt with similar situations before. "Do you want me to call the Civil Rights Division? This sounds like a federal case." Derek felt the blood drain from his face as he listened to the conversation between two federal agents discussing the possibility of civil rights charges. This wasn't just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with an apology and a handshake. This was a federal investigation waiting to happen, the kind of career-ending nightmare that could destroy everything he'd worked for. "Let me handle this for now," Keisha said, though her tone suggested she was keeping all options open. "But yes, I want this documented in case we need to file charges later." She ended the call and looked directly at Derek, her expression showing a mixture of professional disappointment and personal frustration that he was beginning to recognize as the look of someone who dealt with this kind of prejudice far too many times. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who'd reached the end of her patience, "you have exactly two choices right now. You can apologize for this harassment, report to your supervisor immediately, and recommend yourself for additional training on constitutional rights and professional conduct. Or you can continue to pretend this was legitimate police work, and I can make some phone calls that will turn this into a federal civil rights investigation that will destroy your career and probably result in criminal charges." The choice hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Derek understood that the next words out of his mouth would determine whether he walked away from this encounter with his career intact or became another cautionary tale told in police academies about the consequences of letting prejudice override professional judgment. But Derek Hayes was about to prove that some people would rather double down on their mistakes than admit they were wrong. And that decision was about to cost him everything he thought he valued about his career in law enforcement. Derek's response would show Keisha exactly what kind of police officer she was dealing with, and it would determine whether this encounter ended with education or prosecution. The parking garage had become a courtroom, and Derek was about to render a verdict on his own future. Derek's mind raced through his options, like a computer processing impossible calculations. On one hand, he could admit his mistake, apologize to this federal agent, and hope that humility might save his career. On the other hand, admitting error would mean acknowledging that his 3 years of experience had been built on prejudice rather than professional instinct. It would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that he'd been wrong about fundamental aspects of police work. Pride won over wisdom. "Look, Agent Williams, or whoever you claim to be," Derek said, his voice hardening with the desperation of someone who decided to fight rather than surrender. "I've been doing this job for years. I know trouble when I see it, and I know when someone's trying to run a game on me. These credentials could be sophisticated fakes, and your partner could be part of the same operation." Keisha stared at Derek with the kind of professional fascination usually reserved for particularly interesting criminal subjects. In 12 years of federal law enforcement, she'd encountered denial, anger, and even violence from suspects who'd been caught in serious crimes. But she'd never seen someone dig themselves deeper into a hole with such determined efficiency. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when interviewing subjects who were providing evidence for their own prosecution. "You're now suggesting that I'm part of an organized criminal enterprise that includes fake federal agents and sophisticated document forgery. Do you understand how that sounds?" Derek's radio crackled again, this time with more urgency. "Unit 7, immediate response required on Channel 4. Supervisor is en route to your location." The words hit Derek like cold water. His sergeant was coming to the parking garage personally, which meant someone had decided this situation required direct intervention. It meant questions would be asked that Derek couldn't answer with vague references to suspicious activity and officer intuition. "Unit 7, copy," Derek replied, his voice betraying more stress than he intended. "Standing by for supervisor." Keisha smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Officer Hayes, I think you should seriously consider what you're going to tell your supervisor when he asks why you're detaining a federal agent in a private parking garage without cause, evidence, or legal justification." "I'm not detaining anybody," Derek said quickly, realizing that the word detention had specific legal implications that could make his situation much worse. "This is just a consensual encounter. You're free to leave anytime you want." "Am I?" Keisha asked, her eyebrows rising. "Because when I tried to access my vehicle, you ordered me to step away from it. When I reached for my credentials, you told me to keep my hands visible. When I mentioned leaving, you threatened to call backup. That doesn't sound consensual to me." Each point hit Derek like a legal landmine exploding under his feet. Keisha was documenting every violation of police procedure, every moment when his actions had crossed the line from consensual contact to unlawful detention. She was building a case against him in real time, using his own words and actions as evidence. The sound of footsteps echoed through the parking garage as Sergeant Michael Rodriguez approached, his face showing the grim expression of someone who'd been pulled away from more important duties to handle a situation that shouldn't have existed in the first place. At 52, Rodriguez had 28 years of police experience and a reputation for not tolerating officers who created problems through poor judgment. "Hayes," Rodriguez called out as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with problematic officers before. "What the hell is going on here?" Derek felt his stomach drop as he realized he was about to have to explain this encounter to a supervisor who would immediately recognize all the ways it had gone wrong. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I was investigating suspicious activity in the financial district when—" "Sergeant Rodriguez," Keisha interrupted, stepping forward with her FBI credentials prominently displayed. "I'm Special Agent Keisha Williams, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Your officer has detained me without cause, accused me of credit card fraud without evidence, and threatened arrest when I asked him to justify his actions." Rodriguez looked at Keisha's credentials, then at Derek, then back at Keisha. His expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, concern, and finally a kind of weary resignation that suggested he'd dealt with similar situations before. "Agent Williams," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone who understood he was now dealing with a potential federal incident. "I want to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. Could you walk me through exactly what happened here?" Derek watched in growing horror as Keisha provided a precise, detailed account of their encounter. She recounted his surveillance, his lies to dispatch about crime reports, his demands for identification, and his threats of arrest. Every violation of procedure was laid out with the clinical precision of someone who understood police work well enough to know exactly what Derek had done wrong. "Sergeant," Derek interjected desperately. She was acting suspicious, moving through the area with what appeared to be criminal intent. "Hayes, shut up," Rodriguez snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Agent Williams, do you wish to file a formal complaint about this incident?" Keisha looked at Derek, then at Rodriguez, weighing her options. She could file federal civil rights charges that would destroy Derek's career and probably result in criminal prosecution. She could demand an internal affairs investigation that would likely lead to his termination. Or she could use this moment as an opportunity for education rather than punishment. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said finally, "I'm going to give Officer Hayes one more chance to salvage his career. If he's willing to admit his mistakes, undergo additional training on constitutional rights and bias recognition, and write a formal letter of apology that acknowledges his actions were based on racial profiling, I'm willing to handle this administratively rather than federally." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Derek could accept responsibility, admit his prejudices, and possibly save his career. Or he could continue to deny what everyone in that parking garage knew to be true. Derek Hayes chose pride over survival. "I'm not apologizing for doing my job," Derek said, his voice carrying the stubborn defiance of someone who would rather lose everything than admit he was wrong. "I saw suspicious activity, I investigated it, and I'm not going to be intimidated by threats of federal prosecution." The words sealed Derek's fate as surely as if he'd signed his own termination papers. Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly, recognizing that one of his officers had just chosen career suicide over accountability. "Agent Williams," Rodriguez said with obvious regret, "I'll be initiating an internal affairs investigation immediately. Officer Hayes will be suspended pending the outcome of that investigation, and I'll be recommending termination based on his conduct tonight." Derek's face went white as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his wall of denial. His career, his pension, his reputation, everything was crumbling around him because he'd been unable to admit that his suspicions had been based on prejudice rather than evidence. "You can't suspend me for doing my job," Derek protested weakly. "Hayes," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a death sentence, "you didn't do your job. You racially profiled a federal agent, conducted illegal surveillance, made false reports to dispatch, and violated her constitutional rights. That's not police work, that's criminal behavior." Keisha watched Derek's world collapse with a detached interest of someone who'd seen justice served countless times throughout her career. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only the quiet recognition that some lessons could only be learned through consequences. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret, "I gave you multiple opportunities to make this right. You chose to double down on your mistakes rather than acknowledge them. That choice has consequences." The parking garage fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Derek Hayes stood there in his uniform, still wearing the badge that would be taken from him within the hour, finally understanding that real authority comes from integrity, not prejudice. But the story wasn't over yet. The consequences Derek would face were just the beginning of a chain of events that would change police training protocols, federal oversight procedures, and one man's understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect. The look on this officer's face when he realized he'd just thrown away his career rather than admit his prejudices was absolutely priceless. But what happened to him after this footage went viral will blow your mind. If you're loving watching this racist cop's authority completely crumble, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone choose pride over survival this spectacularly? Because the investigation that followed this incident uncovered problems that went way deeper than one bad cop.